Hello, Pontiac High School. This is our third lesson now looking into laws. This time we're going to be focusing on the types of law, that is, criminal law and civil law. Let's look first at criminal law. A crime is an act that the government considers harmful to society. Criminal law is a set of laws that describes the acts that are crimes and establishes punishments for those acts. So if the government finds it to be harmful to society, it's a crime and will be punished by our government. Now, the purpose of criminal law isn't the punishment side of it. It's the protection aspect that we talked about a couple of lessons ago. Laws exist to protect our society. The idea of punishing people for crimes is linked into this idea of deterrence. Crimes are punished so that the government can deter people from those actions. That is, convince people not to do them in the first place. Somebody knows that they will be punished for breaking into a house, they're less likely to break into the house. That is why we have that criminal punishment. Now, penalties for crimes, by law, must be fair and reasonable. That is, you're not going to go to jail for 5 years for stealing bread from a convenience store. That is not a fair or reasonable penalty. They try to match the penalty to the crime that was committed. Now, those more serious crimes, those that we call felonies, do receive harsher penalties than misdemeanors. Usually, if you cause a major crime, you will be going to jail or prison for a year or more. Now, sentencing guidelines are created to give judges a little bit of leeway in establishing punishments, but also to ensure that sentences are similar. For example, if you're found guilty of a particular crime, the judge can sentence you to 3 to 5 years in prison. That is, if you're guilty, he can't give you 2 years. Has to give you 3. It's in the guideline. But maybe if it's your first offense and it was done under certain conditions that weren't entirely under your control, the 3 years would make more sense than the 5 years. So the judges have some degree of leeway, but in many cases have minimum sentences attached to crimes. Now, sources of criminal law. In the United States, it's legislatures that write criminal laws. And this can happen at a federal or a state level. Michigan has its own criminal laws, and we also have our national federal criminal laws. But states don't always agree on what should be a crime and what should not be a crime, meaning that frequently an action could be a crime in one state, but not a crime in another. We can take smoking marijuana as an example here. In several states, including Colorado, it is not illegal to smoke marijuana recreationally, whereas in the state of Michigan, it is. This is because whether or not an individual is allowed to recreationally smoke marijuana is something that has been decided differently by these two state legislatures, with Colorado saying yes and Michigan saying no. Now let's look at civil law. Civil law is a group of laws that help to settle disagreements between people. No crime has been committed, but there is a disagreement that needs to be resolved. And the courts can take an active role in helping people resolve these problems if they can't do it themselves. In a previous lesson, I used an example of hitting a baseball through a neighbor's window. It may simply be that the neighbor and the people involved can reach their agreement on their own, that they don't need to involve the courts. But maybe they do. And we do have a civil law court system to make sure that that disagreement can be resolved. That is the purpose of civil law. Sometimes that conflict would lead to a lawsuit. The owner of the broken window would sue the individuals that broke that window. Now, in a lawsuit, the court is going to determine if an individual has been treated unfairly. If the person who had their window broken, that was not a fair act, that was an accident, and yet a fair compensation would be for the breaker of the window to pay for the damages. And then the court would decide that, yes, indeed, the person who hit the baseball has to pay a certain percentage of the damages for that window. Maybe the person who threw the baseball, a smaller percentage. Sources of civil law. So where does this idea of civil law come from? Well, it comes from this basic idea that we need to have fairness and justice in our society. that we need to be able to resolve our problems in a fair way so that both sides walk away understanding their role in what transpired and what is the right course of action to take going forward. Now, when many judges reach similar rulings on a lot of similar cases, say there are a lot of instances where a lot of baseballs are flying through windows in a particular neighborhood, those decisions might be grouped together and written as statutory law. They might eventually just take it out of the judge's hands and say, hey, look, if somebody hits a baseball and it goes through the window, that person has to pay for it. It is now a statutory law. The judge doesn't have to make that decision anymore. It goes before the judge, and the judge just says, look, this is how it's going to be. You have to pay it. I don't even need to hear the arguments. That is when it becomes a statutory law. All right, so where do civil law and criminal law meet? Well, criminal law gives the government the power to protect society. That's what it exists for, to protect everybody. Civil law gives a group or an individual the power to settle a conflict. Okay, so let's take a car accident. Okay, there's a car accident. There's a dispute over who caused the accident, who should pay for what in damages. That is a civil issue. But one of those drivers had been drinking. That is, one of the drivers was drunk and violated a crime meant to protect society. We now have an issue that has crossed civil and criminal law. And when the conflict does that, both laws might apply. The drunk driver could very well find themselves in court twice, once for the criminal infraction and once for the civil dispute. And if you've got a civil dispute tied up in a criminal action that you did, that's usually not a good sign for you. You're probably going to lose that civil case. All right, so those are the two types of law that we have in our American legal system, criminal law and civil law. I hope you learned something today, and farewell.